Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Hollywood Cine Mysteries, the channel where we uncover fascinating facts, hidden details, production secrets, and mysteries behind classic movies. If you love classic westerns, forgotten cinema, legendary filmmakers, and surprising movie facts, you are in the right place. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Hollywood Cine Mysteries, like this video, share it with other movie fans, and leave a comment telling us which classic film you would like us to explore next. Today, we are going back to the year 1964 and entering the dangerous world of the spaghetti western with a film called Minnesota Clay. This is not simply another gunslinger movie. Minnesota Clay is an interesting early western from one of the most important directors in European genre cinema, Sergio Corbucci. Corbucci would later become famous for films such as Django and The Great Silence, but Minnesota Clay came before those major works and gives us an interesting look at the filmmaker during the early development of his Western style. The film was released in Italy on November 12, 1964, and it was produced as an Italian, Spanish, and French co-production. The movie runs roughly around 90 minutes, depending on the version, and its original language was Italian. Now, let's talk about the man at the center of the film. Minnesota Clay is played by American actor Cameron Mitchell. Mitchell was already an experienced American performer before coming to European Western cinema. His presence gave the film an unmistakably American Western feeling, while Sergio Corbucci brought the darker European style that would become increasingly important in the spaghetti Western genre. And this combination is one of the most interesting things about Minnesota Clay. It looks like an American Western. It feels like an American Western. But behind the camera, it was largely created by European filmmakers. That mixture became one of the defining characteristics of the spaghetti western. Now, here comes one of the most unusual facts about the movie. Minnesota Clay is not portrayed as a young, unstoppable gunslinger. He is an aging gunfighter whose eyesight is gradually failing. This is a major part of the film's identity. As his vision becomes worse, the traditional advantage of a gunslinger begins to disappear. A Western hero normally depends on his eyes to identify an enemy, aim a weapon, and react quickly. But Minnesota Clay is slowly losing that ability, and that creates a completely different kind of tension. The movie turns his physical weakness into part of the action. Instead of making the hero invincible, the filmmakers make him increasingly vulnerable. According to film sources, the idea of a hero suffering from deteriorating eyesight was not completely without precedent. Similar themes had appeared in earlier Western cinema, including Robert D. Webb's 1956 film The Proud Ones. But Minnesota Clay gave the idea a distinctive spaghetti Western treatment. Another important detail is the film's setting. The story takes place in 1883, placing it firmly in the classic American frontier period. But despite its American setting, the film was not actually produced like a conventional Hollywood Western. This is where the production history becomes fascinating. Minnesota Clay has often been associated with Spain because some Spanish locations were used. However, film historian Tim Lucas examined the movie and concluded that surprisingly little of the film appears to have actually been shot in Spain. Much of the production was instead carried out at the Ilias Film Studios near Rome. The saloon and farmhouse environments, which appear to be part of an American frontier town, were largely created through studio filmmaking. Shooting took place during 1964, with production information placing the work around September and October. This is a perfect example of the filmmaking techniques used by European Western productions. The audience did not need to know exactly where the scenes were filmed. The combination of sets, costumes, camera angles, lighting, editing, and locations created the illusion of a much larger frontier world. And there's another fascinating name connected with the production: Mario Bava. Yes, the famous Italian filmmaker Mario Bava was reportedly present on the set. Cameron Mitchell recalled that Bava was there to assist Sergio Corbucci. Film historian Tim Lucas has even suggested that Bava may have contributed to the cinematography and possibly to the final shootout sequence. That connection is especially interesting because Bava was already an important figure in Italian horror and genre cinema. So Minnesota Clay has a connection to two major Italian filmmakers of the period, Sergio Corbucci and Mario Bava. Now let's move to another important fact: Sergio Corbucci's name. During the early days of European Western filmmaking, directors sometimes used American-sounding pseudonyms. The reason was simple. Producers believed that an English or American name could make a European Western appear more connected to Hollywood. But Corbucci refused to hide behind an American-style pseudonym. Minnesota Clay is considered the first Italian Western, in which Corbucci was directly credited under his Italian name rather than using an English-sounding name. That may sound like a small detail, but it is actually an important part of spaghetti Western history. The film's music was composed by Piero Piccioni, while cinematography was handled by Jose F. Aguayo. Franco Fraticelli worked on the editing, and the cast included George Riviere, Ethel Rojo, Diana Martin, Fernando Sancho, and Antonio Casas alongside Cameron Mitchell. Fernando Sancho is another familiar name for fans of spaghetti westerns. He became one of the recognizable supporting actors of the genre and appeared in numerous European Western productions. His presence helped Minnesota Clay fit naturally into the growing world of spaghetti Western cinema. And the timing of the movie's release is also important. Minnesota Clay arrived shortly after the enormous success of Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars. That movie had completely changed the Western landscape in Europe. Minnesota Clay was one of the early spaghetti westerns released in Rome after the surprise success of A Fistful of Dollars. However, its commercial performance was nowhere near Leone's blockbuster. Minnesota Clay reportedly earned about 400 million Italian lire, while Fistful of Dollars earned more than 3 billion lire. That difference shows just how extraordinary the success of Fistful of Dollars really was. But perhaps the most famous mystery surrounding Minnesota Clay comes at the very end. The film exists with two different endings. In one version, the story ends shortly after the final confrontation, with Clay apparently dying. In another version, the film continues for approximately 4 additional minutes. In that longer ending, Clay survives, appears wearing glasses, and eventually throws the glasses into the air before shooting through the lenses. It is one of the strangest and most memorable alternate endings in spaghetti Western cinema. And this is exactly why Minnesota Clay is such an interesting film for Hollywood Cine Mysteries. It is not just about gunfights and revenge. It has an unusual hero, a mysterious production history, connections to major Italian filmmakers, an international cast, and multiple versions that can completely change the impression of the ending. But there are still more fascinating facts to uncover. In Part 2, we will look deeper into Minnesota Clay's final showdown, the two endings, the English dub version, Cameron Mitchell's unusual role in the dubbing process, and why this early Sergio Corbucci Western became so difficult to find for many years. If you enjoyed Part 1, don't forget to subscribe to Hollywood Cine Mysteries. Press the like button, share this video with fellow classic movie fans, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us this as well. Which ending of Minnesota Clay do you prefer? The darker ending or the unusual ending where Clay rides away? One of the most unusual elements of this movie is the way it treats the traditional Western hero. In many Westerns, the hero's greatest advantage is his ability to see danger before his enemies can react. But Minnesota Clay gradually loses that advantage. His eyesight becomes worse, and the closer he gets to the final confrontation, the more important his other senses become. This creates a different kind of suspense. The question is no longer simply whether Clay can shoot faster than his enemies. The question becomes whether he can survive when he can no longer depend completely on his eyesight. That idea gives the final confrontation a very different feeling from the traditional Western duel. The filmmakers use sound and movement to increase the tension. The audience becomes more aware of footsteps, voices, gunshots, and the position of the characters. In other words, the movie turns Clay's weakness into a filmmaking device. This is one reason Minnesota Clay stands out among early spaghetti westerns. Another interesting point is Sergio Corbucci's approach to violence. Corbucci would later become famous for much darker and more brutal westerns, particularly Django and The Great Silence. Minnesota Clay came before those films, but some of the director's darker tendencies were already beginning to appear. The world of Minnesota Clay is not presented as a simple place where good people fight bad people. Instead, there is distrust, corruption, betrayal, and uncertainty. That darker atmosphere will become one of Corbucci's trademarks. It is also worth remembering that Minnesota Clay was released during an important transformation in European Western cinema. The traditional Hollywood Western had already established many familiar images: the lone hero, the dusty town, the saloon, the sheriff, the gunfight, the horse, the frontier landscape. Spaghetti Western filmmakers took these familiar elements and changed their tone. They often made the characters rougher, the morality less clear, and the violence more intense. Minnesota Clay belongs to this transitional period. It takes recognizable Western ingredients, but gives them a distinctly European flavor. The film's title itself is another interesting detail. The name Minnesota Clay sounds as though it could belong to a legendary American frontier gunfighter. That was exactly the kind of naming style that worked well for European Westerns. Even when the filmmaking was taking place thousands of miles from the American frontier, the names, costumes, sets, and characters were designed to create the feeling of an American Western. And Cameron Mitchell's presence strengthened that illusion. Mitchell was born in Pennsylvania and had already worked extensively in American film and television. His experience made him a natural choice to play an American-style Western hero in a European production. But the film was not simply an American production relocated to Italy. It was created by an international team. Italian filmmakers worked alongside Spanish performers and production personnel, while an American actor played the central character. That mixture was one of the defining features of the spaghetti Western movement. Now, let's talk about another important character, Sheriff Fox. Fox is one of the major figures connected with Clay's past and the conflict surrounding him. The character represents the corrupt side of frontier authority. This is another theme that would become extremely common in later spaghetti westerns. The sheriff is not always a hero. The badge does not automatically represent justice. And the man carrying the gun is not necessarily the good guy. This reversal of traditional Western morality became one of the genre's most recognizable characteristics. Minnesota Clay therefore fits into a larger European tradition of questioning the image of the perfect Western lawman. Another interesting fact is that the movie was not an enormous production by Hollywood standards. Instead, it relied heavily on practical sets, locations, costumes, performances, editing, and atmosphere. The Ilios Film Studios near Rome played an important role in creating the movie's Western environment. This was part of the practical filmmaking system that allowed Italian producers to make Westerns at a much lower cost than major Hollywood productions. The result was a strange cinematic illusion. A film made largely in Europe could look like it belonged to the American frontier, and audiences around the world accepted that illusion. This was one of the reasons the spaghetti Western became such a successful international genre. Now we come to one of the biggest mysteries connected with Minnesota Clay: its different endings. The existence of multiple versions is especially interesting because the ending can completely change the way audiences remember the character. In one version, Clay's story ends on a much darker note. The final confrontation appears to cost him his life. This ending gives the film a tragic feeling. The hero completes his final struggle, but he does not simply ride away into the sunset. Instead, his physical condition and the violence surrounding him lead to a much darker conclusion. But another version gives audiences something completely different. In the longer ending, Clay survives. The additional footage changes the final impression of the movie. Clay is shown wearing glasses, and the sequence eventually leads to the famous moment in which he destroys the glasses by shooting through them. It is an unusual ending because the glasses are connected directly to the film's central theme, his failing eyesight. Throughout the movie, his vision represents his weakness. At the end, the glasses become almost a symbol of that weakness, and the final action transforms him into something almost playful and triumphant. That contrast is one of the strangest things about Minnesota Clay. One version ends in tragedy. Another gives a hero a more optimistic conclusion. This is also an excellent example of how international versions of older movies can sometimes differ significantly. Different markets had different expectations. Distributors could change material, dialogue, running time, and even endings. For modern viewers, this can make researching older European films surprisingly complicated. Two people can watch what they believe is the same movie and remember completely different endings. And Minnesota Clay is one of those films where that difference is particularly important. Another fascinating part of the movie is its English language presentation. Like many European productions of the era, Minnesota Clay was distributed internationally through dubbing rather than being recorded entirely in English. This was common in Italian cinema during the 1960s. Actors could perform their scenes without necessarily speaking the final language that audiences would hear. Dialogue could then be recorded later in different languages. This system allowed European productions to distribute films across international markets much more easily. It also meant that the same movie could sound very different depending on which version audiences watched. For fans of classic cinema, this is an important part of understanding spaghetti Western history. The films were designed for an international market from the beginning. Now, there is another reason Minnesota Clay remains interesting to film historians. It shows Sergio Corbucci before he reached the peak of his Western career. A few years later, Corbucci would make Django, a film that became one of the most influential and controversial spaghetti Westerns. Later still came The Great Silence, a much darker and more ambitious Western. Looking back at Minnesota Clay after seeing those films allows viewers to notice the development of Corbucci's style. The seeds are already there. The harsh landscapes, the morally complicated characters, the distrust of authority, the emphasis on violence, the lonely gunfighter, and the feeling that the traditional Western world is becoming darker. Minnesota Clay may not have the legendary reputation of Django or The Great Silence, but is an important piece of Corbucci's development. It is also a valuable snapshot of the early spaghetti Western era. And perhaps the most fascinating thing about the movie is that its unusual concept still works today. A gunslinger who is gradually losing his eyesight is already an unusual idea. But when the film combines that concept with corruption, revenge, international production, alternate endings, and Sergio Corbucci's developing visual style, Minnesota Clay becomes much more than an ordinary Western. It becomes a fascinating piece of cinema history. So, when you watch Minnesota Clay, don't look at it only as a story about a gunfighter. Look at it as a film made during a major transformation in Western cinema. Look at the sets and locations. Listen to the music. Pay attention to the way the camera presents Clay's deteriorating vision. Notice how the film treats authority and violence. And most importantly, remember that the version you watch may not necessarily be the same version another viewer remembers. That is one of the great mysteries of older international cinema. Different cuts, different dubs, different endings, and different releases can create completely different memories of the same film. Minnesota Clay may not be the most famous spaghetti Western ever made, but it remains an important early work from Sergio Corbucci and an intriguing example of how European filmmakers reinvented the American Western. And that brings us to the end of our journey through the fascinating facts behind Minnesota Clay. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to Hollywood Cine Mysteries, like the video, share it with your friends, and leave a comment. We would love to know your opinion. Which part of Minnesota Clay surprised you the most? And would you prefer the darker ending or the version where Minnesota Clay survives? Thank you for watching Hollywood Cine Mysteries. Stay connected with us for more forgotten films, classic movie facts, production mysteries, and hidden stories from the world of cinema. Until next time, keep watching, keep discovering, and keep exploring the mysteries behind the movies.